Hi and welcome to Perth Open House's third instalment of What If Perth. We're hosted by Brickworks and our satellite friends at O Brother in Mosman Park. The What If is a series of talks that looks at some of the opportunities we have missed, but more importantly, raise a conversation about what kind of architecture and design we want for tomorrow. Tonight's focus is a conversation about the collective opportunity and responsibility, I think was Adrian's words, that we all have as stakeholders in this discussion, and how bringing people into the realm of possibility is as important as the designs themselves. And of this we ask, is the unbuilt no less powerful in its role as in stimulating a collective action or a dialogue than its constructed counterparts? A terrific example of this collective action is the work of Open House Perth itself. The organisation and the event has long bridged the divide between the design world and the public, and for this we applaud you and thank you for your hard work and dedication to this ever vital task, and again for tonight's event. Firstly, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Adrian from Iredale Pedersen Hook, one of Perth's most prolific practices over the last 2 decades. IPH are the creators of some epic projects, including Yagan Square, Perth Zoo and the Minderup Plaza in South Perth. Go for it, Adrian.
We're saying co-creators. And I'll reveal the other people that were equally responsible for those projects. Thank you to Brickworks for hosting this event and keeping a dialogue happening in our profession and in the design world. I think without that we'd be pretty silent right now. And to Carly, who's just given so much through Open House to the design profession, keeping and exposing the world to us. And that's been a phenomenal achievement in quite a long period of time as well. Our little talk tonight is called IPH, in brackets, Unbuilt, or Ghosts, Zombies and their relationship to the living. The ghosts is the idea of those ones that continue to haunt us, the unbuilt ones that haunt us. The zombies are the ones that float around, hoping to come back, and it's borrowed from Peter Wilson, Bollis Wilson. He was our gold medalist a few years ago, and often talks about the ones that keep nagging you and wanting to appear. And then the living, and the idea that nothing is ever unbuilt. All projects relate in some manner to each other, or they float around as a body of ideas waiting to be grabbed, and one unbuilt from 20 years ago might necessarily influence one that's being built today. We've always viewed the acted design as a non-linear path, and in particular we discovered this as a way of, when we were doing our masters through Leon van Schaik at RMIT University, we created this chart which was mapping out the projects over a 15-16 year period at the time under a body of ideas which were loosely linked to geometry, place, time and craft, and the idea that they would evolve and they would change over time. But it demonstrated, even though we mapped it out chronologically in a linear path, it demonstrated the relationship between projects from 20 years ago or 15 years ago at the time, and how there is some form of connection, and that connection is really often intuitive or unintuitive. It's sometimes conscious or a subconscious act. And architecture is incredibly slow, and that's why a lot of people come into the profession and have to move out of it, because we commit to a project and 4 years later we get to actually inhabit the space, or ideas are incredibly slow at manifesting at times. The project here was literally a project that started as a competition whilst I was working in another practice in the evening in 1996 for Barcelona. And it was only through the act of putting this presentation together that you start to actually find links. So suddenly the idea of putting together a presentation makes you go back into a deep archive, an archive that's existed for probably way too long. And you start to piece together the connections in which way civic space can be created, and the way in which a building or a landscape of building can pull together disparate parts of a city and start to reveal unseen parts or new ways of actually seeing a city. So Yagan Square, which was co-created with Lions and Aspect Studio, has exactly that phenomenon. Its proportions in many ways are defined by the parameters of the Horseshoe Bridge and a series of unseen and uncovered tunnels underneath, whereas Barcelona, this project in Barcelona, which was for the Mies van der Rohe archive, created by Gustavo Gilli as a competition, its proportions were defined by the buildings around it. But equally it became a landscape, one of undulation, where one moves from Montjuic, the mountain of Montjuic in Barcelona, down, threading through existing buildings, down a surface of green granite and into the building, much like Jagen Square, which is a landscape that emerges out of the ground, almost an ancient landscape. And then a subterranean world where light is filtered and people are vicariously viewed through openings. And then the re-emergence back into the outside, which then starts to particularly focus on precious or important parts. In this case with Barcelona, the fantastic granite wall of Mies on the Barcelona pavilion, which suddenly transforms that from being an incredibly small scaled piece to an incredibly large scaled piece. And the manner in which you stitch together pieces of a city with literally one act of a project, and the manner in which this stitches together the city and comes back to ideas that were created by others, the master planning of the city, Serda's grid with La Diagonal, which runs its way through the middle of the site on a diagonal. But some of those things almost didn't exist. Jagen Square almost didn't exist. Another project, an unbuilt project, connecting different platforms of Central Station together. Sometimes things are better left unbuilt because they limit opportunities or future opportunities. Jagen Square would never have evolved if this had evolved. We would have been happy, but I think we wouldn't have been anywhere near as happy, and the city would never have been anywhere near as happy. And then there's the lingering ones. Yeah, that's the zombie that really does need to become physical, where this idea of these digital tubes, an information centre, an invited competition that we lost, that sits at the head of Forest Place. Once more, its height is defined by the towers opposite. Or the What If program, commissioned through the City of Perth again, where we created a tower that sleeves over the existing monument, protecting it eternally. But finally, in Jagen Square, this idea of this circular digital tower is manifest and offers a great cultural opportunity for the city. Or for the City of Perth, once again, a living room chandelier, a project that was an ideas competition that never eventuated. But the life of this continued as a terrine in baking architecture and exhibition. And like all edible architecture, after a little time it starts to fail and eventually ends up in the bin. We just hope that our buildings have a longer shelf life than the terrine. Sometimes with the unbuilt we're left with an animation or a piece of something that for us is delightful to reflect back on and look at, and if anything it brings out the joy that creating it in the first place brought. Kruger and Dorfmeister in the background and a roving person that can't quite find their place. But this is the Leederville Fire Station, where we were commissioned to transform that into medical practitioner suites. So the idea of keeping the building, clearly keeping the building and the fabric of the building, and where we inserted something, we made it very clear that it was an insertion, a contrasting rustic timber insertion within the space. A little bit slow, just like Kruger and Dorfmeister, get into the groove. And eventually our roving person ends up in the top right hand corner on another building. Prime position. And sometimes it's the act of making that is what we remember the most. In this case, the Cottesloe Surf Lifesaving Club competition. We came second. The winning project by Mork and Space Agency unfortunately wasn't built. But through this act we discovered something ourselves. Finn went out and managed to somehow get some pewter and melt it down and carve it into a little bit of cuttlefish, and out from that emerged this fantastic beautiful model. And sometimes we need to delve into the archive and bring out that archive into the public realm. Sometimes it's very ad hoc, the idea of hosting an exhibition for 1 or 2 people. And in that process of hosting it, we start to then find relationships between the unbuilt projects and the built, and between the context of a big tree with a table wrapping around it, or a rustic brick wall and a couple of projects. And we always ask ourselves, do we ever change? We have this interesting theory that perhaps we actually don't change, and who we are as students of architecture remains with us. And in many ways it should remain with us, that enthusiasm, that optimism, and the desire to take risk. But what we start to understand, and this is the I, the P and the H, the Idale, the Peterson and the Hook with our final year student projects, which we can look back on in sort of embarrassment and amazement at times. But when we come together as a collective act, that's when the projects really emerge as something quite unique. It's not the individual, it's that idea of relaxing your individual ego and being welcome to that body of ideas that are floating around waiting to be grabbed collectively, and trying to find what is the best idea for that project. You know, ideas are precious, but they're not mystical. They're there, and it's that matter of actually welcoming them into a space and being prepared to nurture them. And sometimes ideas that begin in a public realm for a competition in Brazil, such as an entire public space which is proportioned around Le Corbusier's Modular Man, manifests as simply a painting on a wall, a painting that existed in Casa 31, the house we recently sold, a house that co-created alterations and additions with Caroline de Costa, my partner and architect. And the Le Corbusier, my son recently told me, that figure has always scared the hell out of him. Or the lid, the idea of how we mediate scale and how we bring the proportions of a space down. Something that began also in that competition starts to have a realisation in Manaj Park, not far from here. And sometimes that process of finding and realising a project, and many times there's numerous unbuilt projects within the one project. So going back into these and looking at these is really a rewarding experience. The idea of the sketch before a brief has even come, usually accompanied by a bit of drink late at night, versus the sketch on the back of a postcard while sitting in Helsinki, doing an Alva Aalto tour. And then it's that process of shrinking the project to try and meet budget. And eventually you get there and it becomes a phenomenal project. But within that is still embedded its precedent. And the idea that, yes, it is a collective act, and part of that collective act is actually being able to feel proud and acknowledge the precedence of a project. And the idea that even within a sketch that is looking at the project in an investigative manner, rather than a hyper-realistic render, starts to still retain some of the unbuilt, some of the unimagined. And it's great when a client says, that project when built is so much better than that sketch. Hopefully that's the case. But sometimes the unbuilt also creates a breakthrough. In this case, it was a really early project from 2000 where a new house in South Perth was being heavily contested by the local planners. But for us, it shifted from being a new house to alterations and additions of an existing house, which was budget driven. And so in the context of shifting from a new house to alterations and additions, that process of literally taking and layering the ideal being the new house with the unideal, or what was termed the unideal, being the alteration and addition that was, or the house, existing house that was unwanted, we found a new pathway. So the unbuilt process suddenly became highly successful. And it's a process that we see echoed in one of our heroes, Hans Scharoun, and his Haus Schmenker in 1930s, early 1930s, to when the Nazis had come into power and he was forced to look at a different way of designing. But that process was a long process to achieve. And the sketches on the right-hand side show within that one project there were multiple projects. And we still had to look at how we might cleanse ourselves by realising this diagonal planning of the original house and how we might test it, in this case in an alteration and addition in Aegina Street in Mount Hawthorn. One of our sort of, in a way, really quite modest projects that is not really well known. And sometimes it's the reversal where the built projects influence a project at the time. We'd come to a point where we felt the alterations and additions were much more successful and intense because we were working with an existing series of spaces. we felt the new houses were lacking conceptually in terms of rigour. So we picked on the idea of saying, well, let's collect elements of the built to then bring it into the unbuilt, or more graphically, Dawesville, the floating of Dawesville, the meandering formal plan language of Reynolds, and then the folded formal roof language of Swan Street into the Dragon House. It became known as the Dragon House, not that we began there, but that's where it sort of ended, and the client was really quite happy about that. And then there's the lingering ones of pods, platforms and parasols. It's a long pursuit, a slow pursuit, and it's stretched across a number of projects over the years, many unbuilt, such as the Broome Bird Observatory, a project that we reflected upon 20 years ago. The idea of the pods, the platform and the parasol, which are very much around this idea of minimal interruption to the site, minimal time on site. How do we manage climate but create a very delicate roof form with feathering edges, as well as a little tower that would allow one to observe the landscape. And finally, we managed to realise this in a project, a Walmajari Language Centre in Jiggery, a project that was incredibly successful because of its really grounded nature, its idea, its pragmatic nature, but at the same time, the manner in which it can relate to the distant landscape. The idea that it becomes a figurehead to a town looking out over a series of mesas. And the idea of transferring technology from the unbuilt, in this case, the field house for Anthony Gormley and for the Festival of Perth. We didn't realise the actual field house project, but the sculptures, or 51 sculptures, were placed. And what we experimented there was quite old technology, basic technology, the Kalgoorlie safe, and transferred it into our own house. The idea of drip feeding water down a fabric screen. The wind blowing then cools the space. And sometimes the unbuilt is the most rewarding in terms of it's given us more opportunities through remaining unbuilt, as in Jewel Cave Visitor Centre. We came second in this competition and we really loved the project, and it was a project that evolved out of the pragmatism of trying to meander around ancient trees and the fire offset distances. What we found by the time we'd actually worked out the space available, it almost equalled the space of the program. Thereby the formal language and shape of the building was almost a given. And this we celebrated, and we thought, well, we don't need to think about that. What else can we think about? And then it was invited to be exhibited as part of Unbuilt Australia by the creative directors in 2014. And suddenly they were recreating it through their own eyes, recreating it three-dimensionally. So we were able to see it through other people's eyes. We were able to stand back in a way and go, wow, this is great, because people are developing this project for us far beyond what we'd developed it ourselves, and we're loving it. And then it manifests floating through Venice near the Academia Bridge. So we wandered around looking for it virtually. But then it does have a resonance, and suddenly this idea of working with the constraint of a series of ancient trees or mature trees, and the manner in which a building might be semi-embedded and simultaneously hovering, and the manner in which it has its precedent. Our Jewel Cave was obviously influenced by Aalto's Finlandia Hall and Pietala with a Dipoli in Finland and Feeling and Gurgle in Berlin. The manner in which these embrace constraints and turn them into positive attributes. And this opportunity to once more embrace the mature ficus tree at City Beach Residential College, wrapping the building around, thereby reducing the scale of the building to the street, of Residential Street, but also creating a sort of sense of ownership to that tree, and the tree becomes the figurehead that protects the building and protects the students. There's also been a series of projects where we've collaborated with international architects, in particular Peter Wilson from Bollis Wilson. This one was a losing competition again. We're very good at losing competitions. I think we all have that experience, and they're part of that world of the ghosts and the zombies. But what was more interesting on this one, at the time it was King Square in Fremantle, and I think we were all pretty conscious in the design profession that we were all fundamentally fighting for the third spot, that the first and the second were somewhat of a given in terms of who were going to be shortlisted. So we thought, well, how do we actually turn the process into something that is equally as rewarding? So we approached Peter Wilson, and he offered to be a mentor to us on the design. And so we then invited a number of students from UWA to come in and be mentored by us. So there was this sort of role of us being mentored by a master in a way, and then us as local architects assisting the local students. And what began was an intriguing architectural sparring of sketches. I've always been inspired by Peter Wilson's sketch on the right, mine on the left. This dialogue of marking up drawings and sketches and exchanging them, finding precedent, things that we've discovered through our cultural baggage of travelling and other things. You know, things are never squashed. They always emerge in some manner, and you've got to allow them and just grab hold of something. Sometimes ideas can be completely silly, but then they start to actually become quite meaningful. And this project ended with the Brickworks study tour a couple of years ago, where we visited the Luxor Theatre in Rotterdam, and I found myself sketching his own project when built. So the idea that we were returning the built to the unbuilt. And more recently, the Harry Butler Design Institute, we were shortlisted, or longlisted, whichever way you want to look at it, to participate in the competition. This time it wasn't necessarily Peter mentoring us, it was Bolus Wilson with Ardale Peterson Hook and Aspect Studio Perth. And what started to emerge was this fantastic dialogue and exchange where everyone felt comfortable working over the top of each other, to the point where when we presented the projects, they became a hybrid. A couple of my sketches on the left, IPH, and then up the top, a digital image by Aspect, down the bottom a painting by Peter Wilson. And they were all brought together to actually create meaning. They were accompanied by text and a verbal description as well. But we found that this idea of authorship was incredible because everyone contributed. And there were moments when the wacky would start to appear and a bit of Chinese text would appear, and we would have to ask Peter for an explanation. And then COVID lockdown occurred over Easter. And Peter then launched into this series of oblique projections, which began as large-scale pencil drawings of meandering around the building. Incredible. And simultaneously with this, we were creating a digital render, which we didn't want to make too colourful. We wanted to allow Peter's paintings to be the things that spoke of colour and texture, and we purposely left the renders as quite, in a way, monolithic and white, almost like 70s sort of computer renders. A little painting at night time by Peter, and then the grand finale was this fantastic approach from the east, from Murdoch. And simultaneously we were describing the project using built works, built approaches, and text out of key documents that we'd been reading. And we let Peter have the last laugh with Harry Butler with an earring and a big beard moving inside. This will be the final project. And I think to some extent it's one of our smallest ever projects. And it was a project that only existed for a short period of time. It was for the Festival of Perth. It was an engagement called the Architects Project. 4 architects and 1 artist were engaged to speculate about our ideal fantasy city and to exhibit this in a billboard. Our first act was to say, well, we're architects, we want to do a space. Our site was the site of the Northbridge Plaza. At the time it was just a grass field. And we actually donated our fee back so we could have more space, so we could actually make it as an actual space. And we started with the idea of the ring, which was based around the merry-go-round. And we called it the merry-go-round of dreams and ghosts. And on the outside were all the dreams unrealised by over 100 years of architects speculating about the city. So it was a collective fantasy, it wasn't just our fantasy. And on the inside were the ghosts, the projects that existed and were removed. And the commentary around it was simply saying, if we were brave enough to embrace those projects, those ambitious projects, and if we were mature enough to retain the heritage, our city would be very different. And it would be the fantasy city of the one that we speculate about now. But that was 2008, and I think Perth has come a long way since then. And it's really interesting to look back on that because it's now a city that's matured, I think, quite gracefully and is much more optimistic than when we first worked on this project. We did all sorts of things where we put totem tennis poles in the middle and we left the rackets and we just let people, we filmed people just playing. We had bands that just set up under it, and it was this really bizarre and rewarding scenario where you realise that the act of just creating a very small public space with a sense of definition is enough to invite people and allow people to start to inhabit it. Finally, I'd like to dedicate this to Bob Reynolds in memory of Bob, who passed away yesterday. He was our client for the Reynolds residence from the year 2000. Phenomenal person, became a really good friend. And I think it's people like Bob that make our world very different. He embraced us when we were very young architects. We'd only been existing for about a year. And he had the absolute confidence in us to speculate and take risk. And when we did this project at the time, everyone was going, "My God, what have you done here?" And it's a house that they still use as a reverse weekender. The family would spend many times here. Their son Adam, who's also an architect, and Tanya, they had their wedding reception in this house. So it's this beautiful idea that, I won't even call it a house. It was a lesson I learnt many years ago up in Kununurra when I was walking onto one of our sites, and the floor pad was in the shape of a H. And there was a little local Aboriginal girl, and I said, "H equals house," and she goes, "No, H equals home." Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Do you want to sit here? Or are you okay?
No, I'm good here, thank you.
So some lovely words there, including collective fantasies and graceful maturity. Our ideas can be completely silly, and it's a fight for third. So our next speaker is the infamous Jen Lowe from Olo Studio. So in my personal opinion, Jen Lowe is the director of one of the best interior practices in Perth, if not in the country. If you've stepped into Chicho, Gelato, Willing Coffee or Dilettante in Claremont, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and you will have witnessed Jen's artistic and rigorous approach to interior architecture. Jen's incredible work has also been represented in the media and publications all over the world. Take it away, Jen.
Thank you, Kate, that's very kind. I just want to say thanks to Adrian and also to all the other presenters that have presented as part of this series. It's been really nice to pick up on recurring themes about, I guess, shared understandings and also challenges in terms of how we relate to the public and how we can relate better to the public. So I'll touch on some of those things in what I'm going to say tonight. For those of you that don't know us, as Kate said, we are an interior design studio. We have a pretty long portfolio of work in the hospitality and retail sectors and a growing portfolio in residential and mixed-use projects. In the last year or so, we've been involved in 3 competitions, so the Indiana in Cottesloe, Tawari Spa site in Dalkeith, and the Spices site in Fremantle. These are all really interesting sites, and for me represented a really unique opportunity to work with other practices, and I think that was what was one of the most rewarding things about it, was that ability to come together and collaborate with other design teams. So I've decided tonight to focus mainly on Indiana, despite my earlier intentions to cover them all. There was too much to cover in one. So our submission for Indiana was largely misunderstood, and this kind of gives me an opportunity to show some people all the stuff that doesn't get presented. The Australian and particularly the local press have a lot to answer for, where an inability to engage deeply and provide informative debate are concerned. So I think that was one of the key learnings for me in the process, and it highlighted for me a need for architects and designers to engage more energetically with the press and to have their voices heard and their thinking heard. This is of course difficult within a competition process. So Indiana, we were a part of the winning competition team together with Durback Block Jaggers and Aspect Studio. So this scheme will not be proceeding, and Tadarang is reconsidering the future of the site. This is based on feedback from the community, public outcry about losing the original building and numerous other factors. I think the danger in saying yes to a scheme that pushed boundaries loomed larger and more imminent for the client than the danger in saying no. So the works I'll show tonight are a collaborative effort of the team, while any opinions I share are my own. As the only interior design company presenting, I don't know about the East Coast, but here in WA for the What If series, I thought it would be valuable to share the project with you broadly, and then touch on our specific roles with the interior design sort of focus and the richness that can bring to a project as well. So there's a real energy, I believe, that comes from running an open and transparent design competition. It stimulates engaging debate about what's right and appropriate for a site. Public involvement, when done right, is hugely beneficial and positive. And I have to say the Indiana briefing process was thorough. On paper, Minderoo took all the right steps in engaging community, but the process and outcome were ultimately flawed. And despite huge effort and genuine attempt to work with the community, it was a difficult outcome, should we say. So at the beginning of the process, hang on, here we go. So here's the site. This is the lease area for the competition, which the competition actually then allowed. There was a certain budget within the lease area, and then it extended. There was an additional budget to actually provide public works beyond the lease area. So at the beginning of the design process, DBJ looked in length at how to retain the existing building. And as a team, we feel really strongly that conserving and renovating is the most interesting and the most beneficial way to proceed wherever possible. But times have changed, and I do think that most good architects go down this path as a first step these days. But in this instance, the site did have a lot of problems. The tea rooms occupies the beachfront edge. It leaves isolated and ambiguous space between it and the street. So the broad terraces come to an abrupt end, views and circulation are blocked and impeded, and there is a poor interior layout and difficulty in the way that the services operate within that building. So it was decided not just by us, but by, I think, most, if not all of the submissions, many of the submissions, that to make an omelette you need to break some eggs. So of the 4 finalists that came in, none of them retained the building. So at the very beginning of this sort of process, that was where things stood. So I'll talk a little bit about our concept. So it's true and unique that movement on a beach is free. We pass from shade to sun, sand to sea, grass and back again. We lie, we move, we sit still, we laugh. It's very much a free and easy experience. A building at the beach does not need to have a front door. It's open on all sides. It's neither closed nor sealed. It provides welcome respite and service from outside in and inside out. It's a destination and a pathway. It meets the natural contour where it lies and opens at every level to the landscape, connecting shade to sun and land to sea. Here, in this sketch, is shown that the traditional elements of a beachfront pavilion, colonnade, terrace and roof, are folded and moulded into a topographic landform. It's both building and landscape. The city inhabits nature, nature inhabits the city. So the idea is that this makes a really leisurely and pleasurable architecture of gardens and free spaces. So our proposal landscapes the full depth of the site. It increases the spread of the footprint and liberates views and gardens at every level. The terraces which are existing, which we'd all be familiar with spending a bit of time on possibly, were extended and elevate through the site and create a new topography. And this sort of creates also a continuous variation of the orientations and connections that you make as you travel through the site and come in and out of the various buildings. So this is the sketch plan. So at the southern site, one of the key things was to introduce new accessibility path links. So this connects the street to the beach at every terrace level. And this ties in with the amenity that's sort of outlined in the Cottesloe master plan as well. I think this is a really key sketch that DBJ produced about the scheme. So the accommodation within the leased area has increased from 850 square metres to over 3,000, and yet the external terraces and gardens are also increased from 700 square metres to over 2,000 square metres. And it shows that a massive part of the scheme was not about the building, but it was in fact about the landscape. The team genuinely loved the site. We loved the beach. We wanted a scheme that provided a building that functioned economically and had minimal impact. A really small part of the scheme was a little icon, and that's what we call the two islands. So these two buildings create a public place on the street for markets, for mooching, for hanging out. And the key to this is not necessarily about the look of it, but about the feel of it and creating free space. So as you'll see, this is a section through the later scheme. There was a couple of rounds of submissions as a part of this process. And you can see here that the landscape is used as a mediator, so experience is designed to start fresh at every level. The ocean pool was key as well. DBJ consulted with a marine engineer, and together they developed a preliminary design. This was based around the Cottesloe currents and the wild weather, and it also took into consideration the sea level rises ahead in the future and ways for that design to be modified. So a groin is a man-made structure, and so this is what guided the location of the pool. Adjustments and improvements can be made without disturbing natural or Indigenous heritage, which there is a lot of further down in the site. The other thing was the immersion in nature that we wanted this to provide for all people. So it's particularly for less able people, the opportunity to have an ocean pool and be projected out into nature and into the ocean is a really wonderful thing. At the top of the site, on the street level terrace, the two island buildings took reference from Rottnest and from Garden Island, and they connect to the strong local narrative that surround these islands. They're strategically located to increase the height above the street and enhance the Indiana's landmark visibility. So the shapely green copper building on the right almost becomes an additional Norfolk Island pine. And we all know these are visible on the return trip from Rottnest. These perch above the beach, sort of like a bird's nest in the trees, and provide long views to Rottnest and the horizon. Adjacent to that is the function centre that is long and low and heavily planted with coastal grasses and wildflowers on the roof. So I'll talk now a little bit about the brief and the interior strategy. So broadly, the client brief for the Indiana site called for increased public amenity. That was a very big part of it, and then also 3 tiers of dining and an event space. So during the concept development, we at Olo consulted numerous hospitality operators, and we chatted to them about venue capacities and what they thought was actually sort of feasible and manageable at the beach. And you know, Perth's not a massive city. We need to create something that's suitable for this venue. So the key points that we adopted were the development of venues that could be expanded and minimised to suit trade fluctuations. Also something really important, you know, in a coastal location which is really affected by the weather and the time of year. So we also saw that there was an opportunity for a pretty large venue in the sort of mid-level range, which is located on the garden terrace level. So a high capacity venue there, and limiting the fine dining, which was a part of the brief we thought should be limited because it's not something that's hugely successful, I think, amongst the local market, and a smaller offering be more powerful there. But we recognise that a connection between that and the event space would be really valuable for servicing high-end events and things. So the building floor plates were driven by these studies, and they respond to amenity, flexibility and function, but still maximising on the views and aspect. So now I'll talk you through the different interior schemes. So starting at the beachfront. So across all the levels, the interiors responded to the immediate terrain. At beach level, it's about the sand, it's about the sea. This is where you feel the intensity of the ocean, and the materiality reflects this. It's about sandy feet, cold drinks, an eclectic crowd, laughter, loud, noisy, this sort of thing. And we envisage this space as a sort of a restaurant come market. There's food offerings with cult student followings, things like Frankenfoot or in Northbridge or Hector's Deli in Melbourne, really great fish and chip offerings. And the design lends itself to this versatility. You can see in this image here the scalloped ceiling with a tile on it, which was, there was various spaces in the building that we sort of allocated as spaces that we wanted to be put aside for other people, so for artists to get involved to provide works and local stories that are integrated into the architecture. So on the beachfront level, the white box there, that's the hospitality sort of public space at the front. And what it does, it conceals a working core behind, which was one of the key elements of this scheme. The waste, storage and access were crucial. So this building really is in the round. It doesn't have a back of house that's visible to the public at any point. And there's a service lift connection at the back through all the levels. The other thing is there was really generous public facilities integrated on the ground floor there, which have access straight off the beach and allow opportunities for natural ventilation and still feeling like you're at the ocean when you're using those facilities. So the division of services was designed to create a sort of a dynamic experience of space. There's a large internal courtyard, and what that does is create, I don't know if you can see that in the hospitality space there, but that sort of creates a wind-protected outdoor winter retreat that's within the internal space there and throws a lot of natural light into that sort of subterranean space. There's various kitchens that allow for those different food offerings, and then the bar on the right was designed to sort of provide for the morning service with the, what do you call it, the polar bears, the early morning crew down at the beach to come in and use that space, and then that transitions during the day and changes its offering. So now I'll move on up to the garden terrace. So this is connected to the largest sort of landscaped area on the site. And this really was sort of seen as the beating heart of the development. There's about 45 metres here of 180-degree views to the landscape. So our vision for this space was an interior that evokes a sense of ease and connection to the landscape. So layered and dressed and casual and accessible at the same time. It was carved from the landscape, so very much using local materials, so sandstone, limestone, laterite, local timbers, and also integration of local design would have been key in the specification in here. So high calibre, but also very accessible. So the dining tables in here flow easily to lounge areas and back again. Move through. So the space was divided into precincts, which would allow sort of varied opportunities for interaction. On the north side, eclectic casual seating and bar style service, which is suitable for functions and events flowing onto grass areas, which is quite different to the southern end, which is a more structured seating but really connected to food theatre. So this was sort of envisaged as sort of raw food, seafood bars, chef dining, wood-fired pizza, all along kitchen space, which was designed for sort of high volume service. The street level, of course, is kept relatively clear, so open shaded canopies provide community spaces. So up here it's all about markets, food trucks, pop-up events, in deep summer shade and winter sun. Again, we have a tiled canopy that arches over this shared space, and again it would be a collaboration with another local artist, so something really reflective, colourful and joyful. As our scheme's about free movement, the built forms at this level are kept really pared back, and it's sort of lightweight glazing enclosing really just some staircases up to the high levels and a gelateria in the building in the background there at the ground level. We also thought about wayfinding and connection, so with those spaces being on the lower levels, it was important that we cut into the landscape and created views down to those lower levels. We also thought about the accessibility up at this level with having a high-end offering. We wanted to offer valet parking right outside there, but we also wanted to offer universal access to all of the venues through a vertical connection at the front of the space there in the lifts. So upstairs in the what was briefed as the haute cuisine and event space, it was all about a connection to experience. So we viewed luxury as a connection to nature. I think that was what was guiding us here, about experiencing changing colours from day to night and curating sort of the views through interesting openings and connection to landscape. The windows on this level tilt out and create an airy, voluminous veranda, so you've got that sort of elemental experience. When we planned these spaces, we were mindful to service the full community. So at the back there, the service kitchen for the event space connects to all the levels. So whether you're having, a footy gathering, a sports event, sort of post-event meeting, a yoga retreat, or a really high-end wedding, the full gamut of dining experiences can be shared there. And then there's also the opportunity to connect through to the high-end restaurant and have one really large space for other events. So, what we could have had. The detail that was gone into through the various stages of this was pretty significant. There was a lot of stuff I haven't really touched on, like wind and shading studies, water harvesting studies, the planting of interactive sort of educational gardens, bringing back, there was actually some cool studies that Aspect did about the plants that used to be found in this area and what we could bring back to that landscape that are no longer found in those coastal areas. We had meetings with local elders and discussed a framework of how we would look at Indigenous consultation as a part of the process, and also recommended the appointment of an anthropologist to navigate some of this thing as well as heritage considerations. It was really important to the design team that the necessary time and resources would be committed to achieve a really meaningful and authentic engagement with the community, but of course it's kind of chicken before the egg, or which way does it go, and it's really tricky with competition process. So what actually happened was the media picked up one image, and that was what got discussed. So what it was hard to communicate following that is that a competition, one, is a starting point. It's not an ending point. It's the beginning of a design process. And there's opportunity for a lot of engagement and a lot of change. And I think even where the client's concerned, they forget that, because there's so much pressure that comes out of the press and sort of misguided conversations that happen in the public as well. And it is a fatal flaw of the design of the competition process. So if you lose the tide of public opinion from the outset, which I think that we did, things can change really quickly. So one article can create a narrative like East Coast designers that don't know about Perth, or that building's weird. So this sort of thing spreads like wildfire, and that's pretty hard to come back from. So views can also be clouded by the public casting votes on rudimentary information, I think. So I don't know what the answer is here, but one possible idea could be that in these projects where we have two clients, both the public and the client, maybe there's a benefit on building a network of champions before any of the design work begins. So this might be about creating a team of people who are knowledgeable about the brief and its complexities before any design actually begins. Easier said than done, I know. These people might be key stakeholders, public figures, press representatives, elders. They might assist in the development of the brief and understand the constraints, financial, business, ecological, social. They might be the bullshit detectors that come out into the community and chat to people. They might engage and share a viewpoint with the press, and that might be shared with the community. Is there an opportunity for us to get a spread in the paper that really outlines what's going to happen before we get into this sort of single image-based emotional kind of feedback? I know, it all costs money, it's huge, it's difficult, but we've got a dream, don't we? So that's what I'm going to say tonight about Indiana. I want to just very quickly talk about something that's happening right now that I'm not working on, but that I think we should all be discussing. So the Fremantle Traffic Bridge. So This bridge is an example of a site that needs conversation and action. It's 1939 timber bridge and it's deteriorating, and we know it needs upgrading or replacement. So the Swan River Crossings project proposed by Main Roads is going to replace the existing bridge. This image here sort of shows, I think, what we have currently, and then we move across to the new. So what they've proposed is it sits to the east of the current bridge. You'll see on the right hand side there's a little stub of the old bridge that's sticking out. That's sort of considered as the heritage consideration there, which is not very fleshed out perhaps. The new bridge sits to the east and it eats it into the foreshore, including Beach Street, removing sort of some of the limited public landscape that's there. And it looks to me like a more hostile environment than what we have currently. This project's going to cost $230 million and take 2 years to construct. So I think it's one that we should probably have some good discussion about. I'm on the Design Frio committee, and it's through this that I've learnt a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit about this project and understand the need for us to be talking about it. So what we've discussed at Design Frio is that the thing that's possibly delivered us to the point that we're at now is a flawed brief and a business as usual approach by Main Roads. There's been no mention of sustainability targets, which is frankly pretty irresponsible. A cars first, people second, nature third mentality is not going to make a great space here. So at Design Frio, we're trying to spread the word that we're seeking an outcome that will improve on what we have. Better integration with the foreshore, better urban design outcomes, less hostile environment for pedestrians and cyclists to encourage walking and cycling and experience a connection to the river. We want greater transparency, more data, wider consultation to ensure that we get a result that respects the river, the land and the communities, which also of course means meaningful sort of connection to what the Swan River and the Cantonment Hill area means to the Whadjuk Noongar people, which is more than sort of dedicating a plaque or some artistic screening to a bridge. So we just liked people to, if people want to get involved, there's a few things there. Take a quick photo, have a look at those. There's plenty of ways that you can reach out to local government and to Main Roads to demand that we deserve something better. So that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, for
Thanks, Jen.
coming along.
Okay, so I'd love right now to delve into some questions because there's a lot that's been said tonight, and I, happened to get a bit of a sneak brief of these presentations coming together over the last week or two, and so framing some questions for these incredible practitioners has been a part of my week. And so I think I'm going to start with you, Adrian. You talk a lot about the collective act in your presentation tonight, and I wanted you to just elaborate on when you have seen that engagement process work from the sense of the collective act being between the design community and the public, or the people who are the users of the thing that's going to occur at the end of the process.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of different projects we've worked on that I could comment on, and the engagement interactive act occurs differently based around, I think if it's in a remote community or if it's a city-based project, but they all fundamentally have the same ambition, is to, in a non-hierarchical manner, allow people to speak. And that's the hardest part, is allowing people to speak freely and then understanding how to collate that information and present it back in a manner in which you're truthfully showing to them that you've taken on board comments. I think a really interesting one, and I have to use Yagan Square as a comparison to the process for Indiana tea rooms. They're both expensive processes, and they're both very similar in that they start with, they're highly ambitious. They're really important projects to the state. And the groundwork that was done by what was the MRA at the time, Development WA, was phenomenal. And before it even got to the point of being publicly advertised, there was a 400-page book created. Now that had been created through a lot of different engagement with a lot of different people, to the point where when you're engaging with the public, it made a great deal of sort of fun engagement with the public. There were online interactive programs that you could go and you could talk about, and you could actually position things and say, this is what I think this space could be, and you could speculate. And sure, that all gets collated, but then when it comes back to us, it actually comes back to us in a manner in which we can then engage with it. So the work that was up front was so necessary to enable the competition to actually proceed, because a competition is a really difficult process, because especially with public buildings, you're not in an opportunity to actually directly engage with a client body during that stage. You're having to work anonymously and interpret a brief. So the better that brief is, and the more, in a way, specific that is about offering a direction, the better the outcomes are, and the closer, hopefully, those outcomes will be to what the expectations are. And then as one moves forward with the design, the competition process for Yagan, we were still in a scenario where we knew there were significant people that we needed to talk with. For instance, the Whadjuk people. How can we engage with them during a competition process when you can't? You can't go and approach them. You're not working on the project. So we approach them in the manner that if we are successful, will you be prepared to work with us? So it was this sort of idea of respectfully going, if we are lucky enough to win, will you engage with us? And they gave us confirmation, yes, we would be happy to work with you if you are a successful design team. So it was about putting a bit of this in motion. But because so much groundwork had effectively commenced, and we could trust that work that had been prepared, and we were in many ways following that, and what was actually proposed in terms of the placement of spaces, we kept. We thought that all makes sense. We don't have to challenge that. What it needed was a narrative and a concept. And I think moving forward past that point, we were able to then truthfully engage through SWALS, and a Whadjuk working party was created that were consistently involved with the project, and that's really important. You can't just advertise the project or these are the competition projects and responses, let the public vote, because you just revealed so much information in that if the public had that knowledge, their opinion would be very, very different. So our public forum of presenting would be really beneficial. And it's just unfortunate because so much energy and so much time. It is a costly endeavour for everyone to get to that point and to not have an outcome. And there was a beautiful outcome there that should be realised.
So perhaps there is a what if in this, in that the event what if perhaps could be something that is a forum for the designers to share publicly what the intent and what the complexity and what the responses and all of the great parts of those more public projects. Open House already does a pretty tremendous job of getting, I think one year it was 68,000 people through projects all over Perth, and with that kind of reach, maybe there is events like this that can sort of bridge the gap or continue to bridge the gap between a public project and a design competition where the public should be involved. Jen, just on that, I think you and I have had a bit of a chat this week about never surprising your clients. I think we know that we don't, certainly as a practitioner, you don't just dump a bunch of images of a completed concept design in front of your clients without ever having spoken to them before. And so I guess the question is, you have a really great briefing process with your first client, and what lessons can you take about that briefing process with your first client with our second client, which is the public?
Oh, that's really tricky. Of course, the first client or the client first meeting is definitely not about design. And I think that's the same learning that Adrian's just been discussing, is that the first client meeting is about everything other than design. It's about how you want to feel, what you want to have, what your vision for the future is. It's sort of how you live your life. It's your lifestyle. It's not just your lifestyle now, but your lifestyle in 5 and 10 years. And I think that same thing is the briefing process with the public. So I guess the question is, on these large projects, how do we do that? And are we allowed to do it? Because obviously in competitions and things like that, there's very strict rules about how you can and can't engage. So
Yeah.
maybe it's about discussions around, like you say, some kind of way that the briefing or discussion with the public can happen as a part of these processes.
It's a very large and all-consuming beast, but sometimes even I think like having the event not occurring this year and having so many things not occur this year because of COVID, certainly in our practice, has given us a really good chance to sit down and just have a think about how we actually do things, and seeing just the ability of us to connect. We ran a business seminar for small practices recently where it was on Zoom, and I saw the faces of more than 100 small practice directors all over the country, and I thought, how easy is this? And so perhaps maybe it is a good thing that open house isn't physical this year. Maybe this is the kind of forum that we can level the intimacy that you have with a client when you sit down and you have a glass of wine at the start of the project and you say, tell me how you feel about it. And maybe there's an opportunity with Open House Perth and the media to sort of deliver that bridge between the design world and the public. Okay, Adrian, I've got another one for you. So you talk a lot about zombies, which is my new favourite architectural term.
No,
It's very official.
So I've got to credit Peter on that one.
Terrific. Is there a favourite zombie at IPH that refuses to die?
The ones that got away. No, as I said before, I don't do favourites. No, there's a collection of them. Actually, it's really interesting when you reflect. We've now had 21 years of working together in the practice, and there's seminal points within the practice where a project really hurt that didn't go ahead.
Yeah.
And you just you put an enormous amount of energy into every project, but every now and then you feel like you've broken ground on one. And it doesn't occur, and it really hurts at the time, but then as you move forward you realise that you've learnt a lot from that project and the process of doing that has then been embodied and to the benefit of other projects and reinterpreted in certain other ways. And I think the first one was the Wilner residence I showed, the one that went from being a new house to an alteration and addition, and probably the next one was what would have been Perth's first 5-star Green Star office project for Greening Australia, Pioneer Lakes. The next big one was a project we did with Jones Calder Young when Geoffrey London was the government architect, competition winning project for 86 social housing apartments on the corner of Pier and Aberdeen Street. So that one came out of a lot of optimism, killed by effectively put to death by a booming economy. So it's that scenario where a booming economy has the adverse impact of what it should be doing.
Yep.
But I think more recently we've been much more fortunate, especially within the realm of government and public projects that have a commitment to them. They have a financial commitment to them and a time commitment to them. With the residential work in the earlier days, so much of it just doesn't go ahead. There's so much speculation. And we don't do a lot in the commercial world, of developer world, which has equally that amount of speculation and the projects that don't go ahead. We've tended to, in some ways, be in quite a fortunate realm where the projects are more than destined to go ahead. So the energy we can put into them, we know that energy is actually going to result in something that's realised, which is really good in many ways, and we treat them as a form of research all the time, as you would a competition. We don't distinguish between competitions as being a freedom of exchange of ideas and the capacity to do something you normally wouldn't do. We actually prefer to invest that thought into actual projects we know are commissions. We still do competitions and we do enjoy them, but we like to focus our energy, especially now where we've been around for 21 years and the practice has established itself to a certain extent that we are now finally winning projects that we've been trying to win for 10 or 15 years. And we're at a point now where we can really sit back and make space for them and really embrace them and enjoy them.
It's good to know we've got another decade or so to go with Spring Sweep before we get any traction. What did you say before? That architecture is slow. Yeah. Yep. The next question is for both of you, but it's based on something that Adrian also mentioned, which is, you know, this it's back to this idea of zombies and ghosts. But you know, do either of you have a building from today? Maybe I'll start with you, Adrian. Do you have a favourite building that you know is now in the afterlife in Perth that perhaps, you know, there's something in that ghost of a building that you think could inform Perth today?
Not ours. So, any building? Does it have to be one of ours?
Maybe pick one from that cool ring.
From the merry-go-round of dreams and ghosts. Yeah. We only had one of ours on there, by the way. All the rest were... Oh, look, no, I don't particularly have one project. And I would do a collage of a whole bunch of projects, I think, that make the city. Yeah. And what we tried to do with the merry-go-round of dreams and ghosts was to represent that design world from the scale of a house, which was an unbuilt Ivanhoe house, right through to large city planning. There was the unbuilt Donaldson and Warren, back in the days of Donaldson and Warren, at their city master plan, which was one of the early foreshore competitions of the wealth of unbuilt foreshore competitions that have occurred over the years. And that's important, that, you know, a city takes a collection of people to bring it together. And it's not just us as designers. You know, we need that political support. We need a whole collection of consultants, and a lot of it is how do you get the best out of, you know, the most creativity out of our engineers as well, that you know, they're not just pragmatic, that they're actually creatives as well. And how do you bring them all together in a world where we're not having to lead all the design decisions, and you know, when you allow it to come together so that everyone feels as though they have a voice. We try to run that practice in that sort of similar non-hierarchical scenario where often a graduate coming in or a student coming in can inject ideas into a project, and they're often in the prized position of doing all the 3D modelling, and we're standing around going, oh, can you try that, can you try that? But ultimately they're the ones that are doing these tests to then present back, and you know, that's a great position to be in. And you know, and a lot of that is, how do you foster creativity? How do you enable them to come out of a world of being a student? And you know, I showed 3 individual projects of ours as our final year projects, and you know, as a student you interact in different ways. Some of you are highly individual and work from home, some work in a studio environment. I was one of those that worked more from home. So I came out of graduating, you know, having to learn how to actually work in a bigger team environment, and how to sort of understand the delicacies of that, to the point where when we were doing our masters through RMIT, I had this fantastic moment where I realised that I felt comfortable enough to step back and not have to necessarily see the authorship. You know, we all like to see authorship, otherwise we're not going to be designers. But what I discovered through that moment was, by allowing everyone to speak and then collectively curating that, and feeling good about that solutions were so much better. And so much more rewarding for everyone, to the point where, you know, the student in our office has a sense of ownership over the work. And if you can do that with your clients, and you can do that with your consultants, and you know, when you go to visit your local planner and the local authorities, demonstrating to them how it responds to their expectations, their policies, their environment, and then when they input into it, then to go back to them and go, right, this is what you said, this is how we've responded to this, and it really shifts everyone's thinking about a project to the point where, and I think that was part of Yagan Square to begin with. The public were on board before we even started as a competition. They were excited about this opportunity, whereas it was very different down at Indiana tea rooms. It's like, oh no, they're going to take away this historic building, which only looked historic because it had been so fatigued through a hostile environment.
Jen, this one's for you. So Adrian mentioned that architecture is slow and that unbuilt is quick sometimes. Do you think that there was a power in the process of Indiana in being able to really quickly work with, I mean, the constraints of a competition are that you've got a time frame, you've got a set of things you've got to deliver, you're collaborating with an interstate team of architects. Do you think that that process of the boiling pot may have been in some ways the thing that enabled you to produce a pretty epic body of work for all its public negatives?
Of course. There's nothing like a deadline to get you going. Yeah, I think definitely, and I think it's such an amazing location, and there's so much love for that space. And I think that you know that it was a pretty interesting brief, and
it looked like you were really connecting with this idea of what it is to be a West Australian on the beach, having grown up.
Absolutely, and I think that was definitely really strong, and it was an opportunity to sort of think about what the space actually really means, not to me but to everyone. And I think one of the things I've done from after the, looking back at it in hindsight, is gone, yeah, well, you know what, I do not like the existing building all that much, but I understand where people are coming from, and we understood that in the beginning, and we still understand. And so it's difficult not being able to sort of share a process and a thinking.
Or an empathy with that.
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously we don't want people to not embrace change. But yeah, it's really tricky.
Or to be able to sit them down and say, we have to do something bad in order to do something good. But it's going to be great in the end.
Yeah. And I think what's really important is actually the fact that, I mean, I struggle a little bit with that sort of chicken and egg thing, and that the end of the competition is really just the beginning. And I think that's what I would love people to understand. That there's this room for change. Yeah.
The collective act.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that I have.
One thing I enjoy about the competition process is that, compression of energy, that especially when you've got a group of people. And
it's a really good reference,
and it brings people together quite quickly, because you're just in a fast pace, and so you're not sort of holding back. Everybody's
but you also don't want to let people down, especially you're working with Durbat Block Jaggers, an aspect, and when we did the Harry Butler, it was like being a student again, especially when someone's on the other side of the world. And I'd get home and I'd get an email from Peter about 10 o'clock at night, and I'd have all these incredible watercolours and markups, and I'd get so excited. I'd start sketching myself, and then suddenly it's 1 or 2 o'clock, and I go, oh no. So I'd email them back to him, and then I'd get to work in the morning, and there'd be this new set of drawings to do. So you sort of feel this responsibility. You don't want to let down your other team, and you also don't want to let down your client, public. And there's all these expectations which you, in the way you place on yourself.
And that little bit of hope that keeps burning inside you, that keeps you going.
It's exhausting when you get to the end of it, but it is like doing it brings back memories of when you do your final year project as a student, and you finally submitted and you go and collapse somewhere.
There is a direct parallel. Yep. University couches. Cool. Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I should thank everyone for coming along tonight to Brickworks, and also everybody at Oh Brother in Mosman Park. Hello, and thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time and energy tonight, and we also appreciate very much Perth Open House's dedication to giving the design industry a voice, and also for allowing us, again, to connect with the people who use our buildings and the people who we ultimately want to please as maybe not our second client, but maybe even our first client. Thanks everyone for coming along, and we really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.